A Mustang was tethered to a tree, her strength fading as hungry wolves draw near. Just when death seems inevitable, a stranger appeared. You won't believe what happens next. This is a powerful story of survival, healing, and the spark of an unexpected bond that defy all odds. The wind howled through the jagged peaks of Montana's Bitterroot Range, carrying with it the scent of pine, earth, and the raw, unflinching bite of winter. Snow flurries dusted the ground like forgotten ashes, settling over ancient rocks and brittle grass, each gust rattling the skeletons of trees stripped bare by the season's cruelty. Amidst this merciless wilderness, a lone Mustang stood tethered to an old pine, her ribs pressing like ghostly shadows beneath a matted, mud-streaked coat. Bella. Her breath came shallow and fast, each exhale curling into the frozen air like smoke from a dying fire. She had once been a creature of wild beauty, hooves that had thundered across open plains, a mane that rippled like liquid night in the wind. But now she was little more than a ghost of that free spirit. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, and her once proud head hung low, a length of coarse rope cut cruelly into her neck, binding her to this living grave. Somewhere in the distance, a low guttural growl echoed, a sound that sent an icy thread of fear pulsing through her weakened body. The wolves had been tracking her for hours now, perhaps drawn by the metallic scent of blood seeping from a raw wound on her flank. Hunger was a merciless guide in the wild, and the pack was patient. They lingered at the edge of the trees, eyes, like dying embers glowing in the dusk, waiting for her to fall. The man who had left her here, Jimmy Davis, had muttered something cruel under his breath before turning his back. Too much trouble. That's what Bella had become. Weak, sickly, no longer worth the feed she consumed. The wind shifted again, carrying with it not just the promise of death, but something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow-covered earth. The wolves sensed it too. Their predatory growls fell to silence, retreating like shadows folding back into the dark. And then he emerged. A figure, grizzled, hunched with age, wrapped in layers of worn flannel and thick leather, stepped into the clearing. His beard was a tangled mass of grey, and his eyes were sharp, pale blue, carrying the weight of someone who had known too much solitude. His name was Arthur, though few in the nearby towns ever spoke of him anymore. A man who had drifted from society like smoke from a snuffed-out flame, swallowed whole by the wild. Arthur didn't speak as he approached. He didn't need to. His gaze swept over the pitiful sight of the dying Mustang, then toward the edge of the woods where the wolves lingered, their glowing eyes narrowed with frustration and hunger. Without hesitation, Arthur lifted his arms and let out a sharp, guttural shout, an echoing command shaped more by instinct than language. The wolves, cautious of the sudden intrusion, melted back into the shadows, unwilling to challenge the unknown. Arthur turned back to Bella. Her body flinched. When he neared, a flicker of life still burning behind her fear-glazed eyes, she smelled of sweat and fear, the sickly scent of infection clinging to her coat. The old man knelt beside her without a word, running a rough, calloused hand across the rope around her neck. His fingers worked with quiet urgency until the knot gave way and the rope fell loose. Bella staggered but didn't collapse. Arthur stared at her for a long moment, as if weighing something heavy in his chest. "You're not done yet," he murmured, voice rough like gravel shifting under boots. "And neither am I." He didn't expect her to understand. Maybe he didn't need her to. But when he pressed his palm against her trembling side, she didn't pull away. The journey back to his cabin was grueling. Bella stumbled with every step, muscles twitching under her thin hide. Arthur led her slowly, whispering nonsense, a steady hum of voice that seemed to ease her, even if she didn't grasp the meaning. His cabin was small and worn, tucked between a crescent of fir trees like a secret the forest had forgotten. Inside, the air smelled of cedar smoke and old earth. Arthur cleared a space near the hearth, laying down blankets and hay scavenged from a forgotten supply in the shed. Every movement was deliberate. Every action carried with it the patience of a man, used to solitude and survival. Days passed in agonizing slowness. At first, Bella refused food. Her spirit seemed broken, her body resigned to failure. But Arthur was stubborn, more stubborn than death even. He cleaned her wounds with shaking hands, boiled roots and herbs into bitter-smelling pastes, and spoke to her in low, rumbling words that filled the silence like a heartbeat. "You've been abandoned before," Arthur said one night, staring into the fire. Bella lay beside him, her breathing shallow but steady. "Me too. Left myself behind out here. Figured I didn't belong anywhere else." His voice faltered, like the crackle of firewood splitting under heat. But maybe that's not how it ends. The first sign of change was subtle, a flick of her ear at the sound of his voice, the slow acceptance of water from his hand. And then, one cold morning, Bella took her first shaky bite of oats. Arthur watched with a strange, hollow warmth swelling in his chest. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was something. The wilderness outside remained as fierce and indifferent as ever. Snow fell in thick, heavy sheets. Wolves still prowled the ridgelines. But within those cabin walls, an unspoken bond began to form, between a broken man and a horse who had been left to die. Arthur didn't believe in second chances, not for himself. But as Bella's eyes began to clear, as her body regained strength, something deep within him stirred. A forgotten hope, and for the first time in years, Arthur wondered if maybe, just maybe, the wilderness hadn't swallowed him whole after all. Days rolled into weeks, the cold bite of winter slowly giving way to the fragile touch of early spring. Each morning brought a hint of renewal, the scent of thawing earth, the crystalline drip of melting snow, the tentative chirp of birds daring to return, and with each passing day, Bella's vitality crept back like a hesitant tide. Her ribs, once sharp as jagged stones, softened under the slow return of muscle and flesh. Her coat began to shed its dull, matted layer, revealing glimpses of a rich chestnut beneath the grime and neglect. And her eyes, those dark, soulful depths, began to shimmer with something Arthur hadn't expected to see again: defiance. She started standing on her own more often, shaky legs growing sturdier with each attempt. Sometimes, Arthur would catch her staring at the door with a restless flick of her tail, nostrils flaring as if she could already smell the freedom of open fields just beyond the cabin walls. The wild in her wasn't gone. It had simply been buried under fear and suffering. Arthur knew the feeling all too well. He spent hours beside her, tending to her needs and speaking in low, rambling monologues. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" he murmured one evening as the fire crackled warmly behind them. "Maybe that's why I found you out there. Maybe we're both too damn stubborn to let the world finish us off." The irony wasn't lost on him. He had come out to the Montana wilderness to escape humanity, yet here he was, pouring every last shred of his will into saving another life, and maybe, in some unspoken way, saving himself in the process. But trust, true trust, wasn't easily won. There were moments when Bella would flinch from his touch, her body stiffening with the memory of cruel hands. The scars that laced her flank weren't just physical. They ran deep into her spirit, stitched by betrayal and fear. Arthur recognized those scars all too well because he carried his own. Not visible to the eye, but heavy all the same. Mistakes he couldn't undo. People he couldn't save. One night, as the wind whispered through the trees like a mournful hymn, Arthur sat on the cabin floor, staring into the flickering shadows on the walls. His fingers traced the edge of a weathered locket hanging around his neck, a relic of a life he no longer spoke of. "You're not the only one who's been left behind," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Bella or himself. "I lost someone a long time ago. Thought maybe if I left the world behind, the hurt would stay behind too. But it doesn't work like that, does it? Bella, lying near the hearth, flicked an ear at the sound of his voice, but didn't move away. That small acknowledgement felt like the tiniest crack in a wall that had taken years to build. By the time the first real thaw of spring arrived, Bella was strong enough to walk outside the cabin. Arthur led her into the clearing, the brittle remains of snow crunching beneath their feet, and watched as she took tentative steps across the open ground. Her muscles trembled with effort, but her head lifted higher now, nostrils wide as she drank in the scent of pine and fresh earth. The wind caught her mane, sending it rippling like a banner of defiance against the sky. "Yeah," Arthur said quietly, "you remember what freedom feels like, don't you?" It wasn't just Bella's spirit that was healing. It was his own. The stillness of the wilderness, which had once been a prison, now felt like sanctuary. His days became a rhythm of care and quiet labor. He mended the fences around the old paddock, repaired the crumbling barn roof, and even began planting seeds in the long-neglected soil outside his cabin. Each small task was an act of defiance against the isolation that had once consumed him. But peace in the wild was fragile. One morning, as Arthur was splitting firewood, the sound of hoofbeats thundered from the ridge. His instincts tightened like a snare. He knew those sounds weren't wild, too organized, too intentional. Moments later, 3 riders appeared, cutting sharp figures against the backdrop of the towering pines. At their head was Jimmy Davis, himself, his mouth curled in a sneer beneath the shadow of his hat. "Well, I'll be damned," Jimmy drawled, his voice soaked in arrogance. "Didn't think anyone still lived out here, let alone some old hermit babysitting my horse." Arthur's jaw tightened. "She's not your horse. You left her to die." Jimmy dismounted, boots crunching against the frost-bitten earth. His eyes were cold, calculating, like a predator testing the weakness of its prey. "You think a man like me cares about that? She was mine when she was born on my land. That makes her mine now. You're just keeping what doesn't belong to you." Bella shifted behind Arthur, nostrils flaring, her body trembling, not from weakness, but fear. The memory of Jimmy's cruelty hadn't been forgotten. Arthur stepped between them, his shoulders squared. "You're not taking her," Jimmy laughed, a low, mean sound. "You think you can stop me, old man?" The tension thickened like storm clouds heavy with rain. Arthur felt the weight of every scar, every failure burning beneath his skin. But when he looked back at Bella, standing strong despite her fear, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her be broken again. "Try me," Arthur said, voice low and steady. For a long moment, silence reigned, thick and heavy as the clouds overhead. Then Jimmy's smirk twisted. "You'll regret this." He turned, spitting into the dirt, and climbed back into the saddle. The riders disappeared as quickly as they had come, their threat lingering in the air like smoke. Arthur turned to Bella, resting a gentle hand on her neck. "I'm not letting them take you. Not now. Not ever." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of fire and ash, Arthur realized that saving Bella wasn't just about her survival. It was about redemption. For both of them. But the confrontation had ignited a fire that wouldn't go out so easily. And deep down, Arthur knew the battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The morning after the confrontation, Arthur awoke before dawn, the sky outside still cloaked in indigo shadows. The cabin was cold, the fire in the hearth reduced to a whisper of dying embers. Arthur sat up slowly, his joints creaking like old wood, and listened to the silence. Not the comforting stillness of the wilderness, but a suffocating quiet that seemed to press in from all sides, a silence that warned him Jimmy Davis wasn't done yet. Bella stood by the door, her body tense and alert, ears flicking at every small sound outside. Arthur could see the lingering fear in her eyes, but beneath it was something stronger, an ember of defiance that hadn't been there before. She was learning not to shrink from fear, but to stand in spite of it. Arthur ran a hand through his graying beard, his mind already racing. They'll be back. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll come for her again. And next time, they won't leave empty-handed. He couldn't let that happen. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. The first thing Arthur did was fortify the cabin, repairing the front door, reinforcing the windows with thick wooden planks. It wouldn't stop determined men, but it would slow them down. He also gathered what few supplies he had. A battered hunting rifle that hadn't been fired in years, a small stash of dried food, and a weathered map of the surrounding wilderness. Every action felt like stacking sandbags against a flood. But, as much as Arthur prepared for the inevitable, he knew that hiding wouldn't be enough. Not for long. Jimmy was the kind of man who didn't let things go. He would come back, angrier and more dangerous than before. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, Arthur stood by the paddock and watched Bella graze. The wind tugged gently at her mane, and for a moment, the world felt almost peaceful again. But it was a fragile peace, one that could shatter with a single wrong move. "You deserve better than this," Arthur murmured, leaning on the fence. "You deserve to run free, not to be chained by men like him." Bella lifted her head, eyes catching his with a softness that struck something deep within him. For all her pain and fear, she had begun to trust him, a fragile bond forged in survival and quiet resilience. And Arthur knew he couldn't let her down. But the weight of what was coming bore down on him like a gathering storm. The first sign came at dawn 2 days later. A plume of dust rising from the distant ridge, growing, larger as it approached. Arthur didn't need to squint to recognize the silhouettes of riders cutting through the haze. Jimmy was back, and this time he wasn't alone. 4 men. Arthur's stomach tightened as he watched them draw closer, their figures dark against the pale light of morning. This wasn't a visit. This was a declaration. He turned to Bella, who had already sensed the danger. Her body was rigid with fear, hooves scraping nervously at the ground. Arthur placed a hand on her neck, his voice steady and low. "We're not going to let them take you. You hear me?" The riders halted just beyond the paddock, dust settling around them like a shroud. Jimmy sat tall in his saddle, a cold smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Thought we had ourselves a little misunderstanding last time," Jimmy called out, voice slick with condescension. "But I think it's time we settled this properly. That horse belongs to me." Arthur stood firm. "You left her to die. She doesn't belong to anyone anymore." Jimmy's expression darkened. "You think the law's on your side, old man. This isn't about right or wrong. It's about what's mine." Arthur's fingers curled into fists at his sides. "You'll have to go through me first." A tense silence stretched between them, thick as smoke. The other riders shifted uneasily in their saddles, hands resting near the butts of their rifles. Arthur could feel the weight of their eyes, the anticipation crackling in the air like the moment before a storm breaks. But Jimmy didn't move. Not yet. Instead, he leaned forward slightly in his saddle, voice low and threatening. "You don't want to make an enemy of me, Arthur. We'll be back, and next time, we won't be so polite." With that, he turned his horse sharply and rode off, the others following close behind. Their departure left behind a trail of dust and a lingering sense of dread. Arthur stood motionless until the last echo of hoofbeats disappeared into the distance. Only then did he exhale, the tension leaving his body like water draining from a cracked vessel. He turned to Bella, who was still trembling, her eyes wide and fearful. "They'll be back," Arthur said softly, running a comforting hand down her neck. "And when they are, we'll be ready." But readiness meant more than fortifying walls. It meant giving Bella the strength to fight for her own freedom. The next morning, Arthur began working with her in earnest. The training wasn't about breaking her spirit, but rebuilding her confidence. They started with small steps, leading her across the paddock, encouraging her to follow commands, helping her learn to trust her own instincts again. At first, Bella was hesitant, every movement cautious and stiff. But Arthur was patient. Every success, no matter how small, was met with gentle praise, a soft word, a reassuring touch. And slowly she began to respond. Her steps grew steadier, her eyes brighter. There were setbacks, of course. Moments when fear took over and she froze or flinched away from his touch. But Arthur never pushed her too hard. Healing was a slow process, and he understood better than anyone that some wounds couldn't be rushed. One afternoon, as the sun painted the sky with strokes of gold and amber, Arthur watched as Bella trotted freely across the paddock for the first time. Her movements were still cautious, but there was a grace returning to her, a spark of the wild spirit she had once been. Arthur felt a lump rise in his throat. "You're stronger than you think," he whispered. But as the days passed, the looming threat of Jimmy's return cast a long shadow over every small victory. The bond between Arthur and Bella was growing stronger, but so was the storm on the horizon, and Arthur knew that when it finally broke, it would test them both in ways neither of them was ready for. The sun hung low over the Montana wilderness, casting long shadows that stretched like claws across the earth. Days had passed since Jimmy's last threat. Days filled with the quiet dread of anticipation. The air felt charged, heavy with the weight of an inevitable reckoning. Every creak of wood, every rustle of wind through the trees felt like a warning. But Arthur didn't waste time waiting for fear to find him. He worked with Bella every day, their bond strengthening like old wood being carved into something new, solid, resilient. Each session in the paddock was a quiet battle against her fear and his own ghosts. Bella's steps grew surer, her movements fluid and powerful. The wildness in her hadn't been extinguished by suffering. It had merely been buried beneath the weight of betrayal. Now, it surged back with every breath, every gallop across the worn dirt of the paddock. Arthur watched her with something close to awe. She was no longer the skeletal, frightened creature he had found bound to that tree. She was returning to what she was meant to be, fierce, free, unbroken. But freedom had its price. The confrontation came sooner than Arthur had hoped. It began just as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold. The thunder of hooves shattered the fragile morning peace, a sound that felt like the earth itself was bracing for violence. Arthur stepped out of the cabin, rifle slung over his shoulder, and saw them. Jimmy Davis and 3 other men, riding hard, cutting through the frost-bitten grass like scythes. They were armed this time, rifles strapped to their backs, cruel intentions written across their faces. Bella stood near the paddock fence, ears pinned back, her body tense as a coiled spring. She could feel it coming. Arthur placed a steadying hand on her neck. "Stay strong, girl. We'll face this together." Jimmy dismounted first, boots hitting the ground with deliberate menace. His eyes burned with cold fury. "This ends today, old man. You've got no right to keep what belongs to me." Arthur didn't flinch. "You left her to die. She's not yours anymore." Jimmy's mouth twisted into a cruel sneer. "You think you're some kind of hero? This is Montana. Out here, strength decides who owns what, and you're just an old man with nothing left to lose." Arthur's grip on the rifle tightened. "You're wrong. I've got something worth fighting for now." The words settled in the air like a challenge, heavy and unyielding. Jimmy's hand moved toward his rifle, but Arthur was faster, not with violence, but with words that cut deeper than any weapon. "She's not property. She's free," Arthur said, voice steady, unwavering. "And I'll die before I let you chain her again." A tense silence followed, thick, suffocating, until Jimmy took a step forward. But before the tension could snap, a sound cut through the stillness. A sharp, guttural whinny. "Bella!" She surged forward, eyes burning with the fire of survival. Her powerful body moved with grace and fury, hooves striking the ground like thunder. In an instant, she was between Arthur and Jimmy, standing tall and defiant. The men froze, caught off guard by her sudden presence, by the raw, untamed force of her will. Jimmy took a half step back, uncertainty flickering in his eyes for the first time. Stupid animal doesn't know what's good for her. But Arthur knew better. Bella wasn't afraid anymore, and neither was he. "Leave," Arthur said, voice low but carrying the weight of every loss, every failure, every ounce of defiance that had carried him this far. "Or you'll regret staying." For a long moment Jimmy stared at him, measuring, weighing, but something had shifted. It wasn't just Arthur standing against him anymore, it was the raw power of the wilderness itself, embodied in the Mustang, standing proud and unbroken. Without another word, Jimmy spat into the dirt and turned back toward his horse. "You're a dead man walking, old man. You just don't know it yet." But Arthur didn't care. He watched as Jimmy and his men rode off, their figures shrinking into the horizon until they disappeared entirely. The weight in Arthur's chest loosened, and for the first time in days, he let out a breath that didn't taste like fear. Bella nuzzled against him gently, her breath warm against his skin. Arthur ran a hand down her neck, voice soft with relief. "You did good, girl. Real good." The battle was over, and somehow they had both survived it. The days that followed felt different, lighter, as if a storm had passed and left behind not destruction, but clarity. Spring crept over the land with gentle persistence. Flowers pushed through thawing soil, painting the hills with splashes of color. The sun rose higher each day, chasing away the lingering chill of winter's shadow. Life returned to the wilderness, slow but steady, and so did freedom. Arthur knew what he had to do. One clear morning, as the first true warmth of spring spread across the land, he led Bella to the highest ridge above the valley. From here, the world seemed endless, rolling meadows stretching toward the horizon, crowned by snow-kissed peaks that stood as silent guardians over the land. Bella stood beside him, strong and whole again. Her coat gleamed under the sunlight, her body pulsing with vitality and grace. She was ready. They both were. Arthur rested a hand against her side, voice thick with emotion. "You don't belong here with me, girl. You belong out there, running wild, just like you were meant to." Bella turned her head toward him, her dark eyes deep and knowing. There was no fear in her now, only understanding. With a final, trembling breath, Arthur unfastened the rope gently tied around her neck and let it fall away. "Go," he whispered. For a moment, she stood still, as if unsure. But then, slowly, she took a step forward, then another, and then she was running, her hooves pounding against the earth, mane streaming behind her like a banner of pure, unbroken freedom. Arthur watched until she disappeared into the vast expanse of the valley below. A hollow emptiness bloomed in his chest. But it wasn't sorrow. It was something quieter, something peaceful. He had done what he had to do. She was free. And maybe, just maybe, so was he. The cabin felt different when he returned. Not empty, just quiet. But the silence didn't weigh on him like it once had. It felt like peace now, like something earned. Days turned into weeks. Arthur tended the land, repaired the cabin, and watched the horizon for glimpses of a familiar silhouette. Sometimes, when the wind shifted just right, he thought he could hear the distant thunder of hooves, a reminder that Bella was still out, there, living the life she was meant to. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of crimson and gold, Arthur stood on the porch and looked out over the wild expanse before him. His heart, once heavy with regret and solitude, felt light for the first time in years. He smiled to himself, a quiet, contented breath leaving his chest. He wasn't alone anymore, not really. Out there, somewhere, a wild Mustang ran free, and, for Arthur, that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, please leave your comment below and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where your support means the world to us. We look forward to bringing you more content that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow for another special story.